why do you think it's so hard for people to say no, even when they know that it's the right thing to do?
There's multiple reasons why we find it so difficult to say no. And it starts with, for a lot of people, social conditioning, the way that we were brought up. I mean, I, for one, was known for being an obedient daughter and student. I did what I was told. I did my homework as expected. And I remember asking my dad at one point, what does my name Sunita mean? And he said, in Sanskrit, Sunita means good. And I mostly lived up to that. So the messages I received, not just from parents, but from teachers in the community, was to obey, be polite, don't question authority, don't make a scene. So we often get those messages. And so we end up thinking and equating compliance with being good and defiance with being bad. And that makes it really difficult. If compliance becomes our default reaction, our default way to manage a situation, it becomes really difficult to say no when we need to, not just when we want to, but when we actually need to. And there's three key reasons that I've found. Like, one is the immense pressure from other people, so the social pressure and some of the psychological processes I've uncovered keep us compliant. So external forces. And then a lot of us don't really know what consent and defiance and compliance actually mean. So getting some good understanding on that would help. And then the last one is, when we know that we want to defy, we often don't know how to do it. So like the skill set, the ability. And for all those reasons, we end up saying yes when we want to say no.
I mean, the timing of this book, I feel like, couldn't be any better. Like, we all just collectively lived through this experience. I mean, now it's a couple years in the rearview mirror, but the COVID pandemic is a perfect example of a point in time where many of us were coerced into doing things that we really didn't, we didn't have much interest in doing.
Right. So I do think it is timely, but I also think it's a timeless issue. There was a quote by C.P. Snow that said, if you think about the long and gloomy history of man, there's been more crimes committed in the name of obedience than there have in the name of rebellion. So we've had this problem for a very long time, and despite all the decades of research on influence that we know and experiences, we're still very compliant.
Was the book inspired? I mean, obviously you have this childhood, it sounds like chip on your shoulder almost, that led to ultimately, you going down this path, but was it in any way inspired by the events of 2020?
Yes. So definitely upbringing, childhood, being a compliant person, really having grown up with a masterclass of compliance. But another reason why I really thought this was the right moment to write the book was during the pandemic and 2020 summer or May 2020, the George Floyd case that came up. And a lot of people think about sort of the man that put his knee on George Floyd's neck and think, okay, I won't do that. But what was also haunted me, not just the image of George Floyd on the ground, which was definitely haunting, but also the rookie officers. There was two rookie officers, one on the third day of the job, one on the fourth day of the job. And they complied with their training supervisor to hold George Floyd down, even though they were checking for the pulse, didn't find one, even though one of them said, should we turn him to his side, which would have been a very simple act that could have saved his life. But being told no didn't escalate anymore. And it was the actions of the rookie officers that made me think, and actually sort of chilled me a little bit, like, what would I have done in that situation as a rookie, unprepared, when my supervising officer tells me to obey?
Yeah. I mean, I remember, I wasn't there at the death of George Floyd, but I remember personally, in relation to that event, feeling pressure, social pressure to, I don't know if you remember the Tuesday when everybody was posting the black square on their Instagram,
right,
as a sign of solidarity with the movement. It was very early on in our understanding of what went down that day, but I felt pressured to post it, and I posted the black square, but I didn't really do it out of, I did it, I remember doing it mostly because of the social pressure that I felt and the general ignorance that I had around the nuances of of what happened. But it's crazy the degree that, a person can be persuaded by.
Absolutely, yes. I mean,
Culture.
the social pressure that we feel, not just by sort of social media, which is very strong at times, but also just within our families, within our own communities, with our work colleagues. There's a lot of pressure to conform with certain things. And I'm remembering one sort of kind of lighthearted anecdote when we moved from the UK to the US, and Pittsburgh was our first stop. And I had a child just about one, and he was in daycare. We were putting him in daycare in Pittsburgh, and there was the staff were talking about getting these Steelers onesies, sort of with the Steelers on them. And when they were going around, I sort of made a comment such as, "Oh, what if he's not a Steelers fan?" And the look on their face, I was like, quickly backtracked. "Oh, no, he is. He is." And so that simple act of like, "Oh, we've got to be on this team. Otherwise, it's just not an option not to be on the Steelers team," right? And perhaps I was worried a little bit about the type of care that he might get. So there's great pressures to conform at times, even when of course he doesn't know if he's a fan or not at the age of one, right? So we do feel that immense pressure to go along with what other people are, to sort of have these harmonious relationships and to all be on the same team.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy in hindsight to judge ourselves for going along, but there has to be some innate, hardwired biological explanation for why, why we feel that pressure and why we ultimately so often act on that pressure, even despite knowing that it's not necessarily the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, when you are rewarded for being obedient as a child, you get all those rewards, right? Even the dopamine, your neural pathways connect to feel reward for doing things that are compliant. You also get social rewards from being as part of a group and a team. It feels good. And that becomes our default. It becomes sort of compliance becomes our default. Also, we wish to have harmonious relationships. So there's a couple of researchers called Hazel Marcus and Shinobu Kitayama, and they talk about two ideal selves. So one is your ideal independent self, where you value agency and freedom, to be able to make your own choices. And the other is your ideal interdependent self, where you value harmony and relationships and putting other people's preferences first. And both are important, and we can never reach either ideal, right? So they're always in some kind of tension. But the problem becomes when we prioritize one over the other, or when we prioritize one that we should not be prioritizing in that moment.
Would you say both are important?
Yes, both are important to a certain extent, because sometimes when we feel the tension, and in my research, in the studies that I've conducted, I've uncovered a psychological process that I call insinuation anxiety. And this is the sort of a distinct type of anxiety that we feel when we basically worry that not complying with somebody else's wishes will send a signal of distrust. So it will either signal that we don't trust them, or that they're biased, corrupt, or incompetent, or something like that. And it's an aversive emotional state. We don't want to do that. And sort of understanding that is really helpful in terms of managing it. But that feeling is there for a reason. That tension that we feel, that insinuation anxiety, is there for a reason, because we are thinking about, oh, we might harm other people, we might harm ourselves, but we're also thinking about the person that has expectations of us, that are we going to cause them some harm, or what are the consequences to us for defying that particular expectation. And sometimes, it's obviously good to think about harmonious relationships and the impact on those, but we often think too much about the costs of defiance. So it's going to cost me a relationship, it's going to cost me a job, but what about the costs of continuously complying? Because there are definitely costs with that. If you're continuously disregarding your own values, that can have an impact on you in many different ways, right? So it can affect your well-being, it can be stressful, less satisfaction at work, burnout, so many different stresses from complying all the time when you don't want to.
It could lead to regret.
Oh, yes. It leads to, certainly when I've complied when I didn't want to, it's led to regret and thinking about it. But that's also, something that could be helpful to us is think about, why did I comply in that situation when I should have defied or I should have said no? And that gives us a chance to reflect on it and think about, well, what would I do if that situation arose again? Because often when we think about like heroic moments of defiance, like Rosa Parks saying no on the bus, right? I'm not going to move. There must have been hundreds of incidents where she didn't say no, right? She complied with the segregation laws and moved. And we also have probably hundreds or thousands of incidences of complying until you get to that moment of defying. And so thinking about those moments, what made me comply, what factors held me back from defying, is really helpful. And just the aspect of anticipating it. Because if you anticipate it, you can start visualizing and practicing for what you wish you could have done. And that changes the neural pathways. Just that practice changes the neural pathways to make compliance less your default and increases your confidence and ability to defy.
Wow. Was there an evolutionary incentive for compliance? I mean, I would imagine as social animals, like, there was a lot of risk associated with defiance.
Yeah, I was speaking to an anthropologist recently who was telling me that, that compliance meant that you don't get killed, right? You stay in your group and there's benefits for staying in the group because the group can look after you. And so that tension, if you want to look at it from evolutionary sort of roots, could be there for that reason. And we do feel insinuation, anxiety, tension, and other aspects because of that. Something feels uncomfortable. And it could be your upbringing. It could be there as a protective response to sort of think about what harm is this going to cause you? What harm is it going to cause other people? So it's not a bad thing to think about those costs. What I think is unhelpful is noticing the tension that we often do and then disregarding it, sort of thinking it's not worth our sort of anxiety, it's not worth our doubt, like let's sweep it under the rug. And that tension is actually what I call the first stage of defiance. It's the warning sign that we might have to defy. And it's a powerful signal if only we listen to it. So if we listen to it, the second stage is actually acknowledging that this might be a situation where I need to defy and thinking about it a little bit more. And it's really important not to just disregard that tension, but use it. It's a signal, it's a strength that you have that. If you didn't have any tension at all, you would just comply with others and not really care about it, right? But that tension sort of signals that there's some resistance, and that's a good thing.
What aspect of a person's personality makes them more or less inclined to comply?
Yeah, so I used to think of both compliance and defiance as a personality trait, and put people into boxes. You're a defiant person or you're a compliant person. And what I've realized in my research is that, first of all, it isn't binary. Like there's gradations of compliance and defiance. And second, I view defiance as a skill, as a practice, not a personality. So one of the myths I think about defiance is that it's often loud and brash and maybe violent or aggressive, or that it's heroic and superhuman and you need a larger than life personality. And that's not true, right? Anyone can defy if you've learned how to defy.
But aren't certain people more agreeable than others?
So agreeableness is definitely one of the big 5 personality traits. I think it's different to being completely compliant and not knowing how to defy, right? So the skill set can still be learned. So say I was brought up in a way to be agreeable. That was also something I learned. Maybe it became a big part of my personality. But if I can learn to be defiant, I think anyone can learn to be defiant.
So cool. Did you get pushback with your research, but then also with the forthcoming book? I mean, we do live in a world that generally, I would say, compels us to comply. But then there are certain pockets, certain maybe fields, professions where that's rewarded to an even higher degree. And I would say, I mean, at least from my outsider vantage point, academia
Yes.
seems to be a field where compliance is rewarded.
Yeah, and in fact, like, so my two main careers that I've had. So in medicine, my first career was as a physician in the UK's National Health Service, and then academia. Both careers are places where compliance is highly valued and expected. So that might be a reason why I wrote this book. Not just childhood, but the careers that I chose as well. I wouldn't say there's been pushback. I think there's been a lot of appreciation from people that have experienced similar things and really want, this is the book that I wish I had growing up, right? I wish I had this before I started my careers in both medicine and academia, and even people outside of that. So I teach now graduate students, MBAs and executives, and they cannot wait for the book to come because everybody could learn more from these skills.
Yeah. Talk about your journey from being a practicing physician in the UK to being an academic psychologist.
Yeah. Well, it was perfectly planned, right? So my first career was in medicine, and that was largely due to compliance and expectations. So in my community medicine, I was actually told medicine is the best thing you can do. So if you have the grades, why wouldn't you want to do medicine? That was the kind of attitude. And I was a little bit doubtful as to whether it was the right path for me. And in the UK, you do medicine, you start at the age of 18. It's a combined undergraduate and graduate degree. So it's a 5-year degree at that point when I did it. And so you're basically working as a doctor by the age of 22, 23, right?
That's so crazy to me. Like, who at 18 is passionate about helping people, about medicine, about health,
Some of my friends were. Some of my colleagues were, like, they knew that's what they wanted to do. I was pretty sure this was not my path. Like, I was very analytical, and I actually wanted to go into research. And I remember someone saying to me, oh, well, so it's 2 years preclinical. You'll get through that fine. And then just get through the 3 years clinical, and then you can go into research. But at that point, there wasn't a lot of career advice. So what happens? I ended up working as a doctor. So it took a couple more steps before I ended up where I am now as an organizational psychologist and a professor at Cornell. But yeah, I think a lot of people, in the US, you have pre-med before you have med, and people can really, there's pros and cons, right? So they can decide whether this is the right career for them.
Yeah, I did that. I started college on a pre-med track, and then I realized, or at least I decided that wasn't the path for me. But then I ended up double majoring in film and psychology.
Oh,
actually,
wow.
So.
Yes. I think that's one of the biggest differences in the UK and the US educational system is that we specialize very early on. So even with A levels, I would have loved to have done English, but I did further maths, physics and chemistry, very sort of scientifically focused before I went to university. So we specialize early on, whereas in the US, I see you can delve into many different subjects that you possibly won't get a chance to experience with that early specialization.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So what do you, as an organizational psychologist, what do you study? Like what? I don't know much about that field.
Yeah, so as I was working as a doctor, I got this opportunity to do some consulting work for the pharmaceutical industry. And it was then I became really fascinated between how industry and the medical profession interact with each other, and some of the conflicts of interest that are there and how closely intertwined they are. And I wanted to study that in more depth. And that's why I came to the US and I started looking at conflicts of interest and advice, influence, and authority in why people take bad advice, for example. So my research really stemmed from there, first in the medical field, and then it broadened to the financial industry and also the criminal justice system. So all industries really looking at why do we take bad advice? Why do we follow other people's orders or suggestions or authority? And I just became fascinated by some of the psychological processes involved in that aspect, and then what factors would help us decrease that pressure. So I've looked at conflicts of interest, advice, ethics, influence, and of course, compliance and defiance.
Well, we have an authority bias, right? I mean, like you're an MD and a PhD, you've achieved a degree of authority. But would you say that it's probably healthy for most people to, despite seeing those credentials, to maintain a critical lens and skepticism? Particularly when, I mean, you've done such incredible work on conflicts of interest, when so many people with credentials, especially these days, seem to have conflicts of interest with, and they tend to be covert too, which I think is the scariest part. It's really important, I think, to maintain skepticism around authority figures.
Yeah, so I also teach critical thinking, and I love teaching that class, and that does involve like a healthy amount of skepticism. Now, a lot of people do trust, especially the medical system, they trust their doctors, and it would be a pity if we didn't have that, no trust in doctors. If that public trust was deteriorated, it would be a pity. But they are conflicts of interest, and we do need to be aware of them. We need to know if there is an ulterior motive for somebody recommending, for example, that you enter a clinical trial. Some of my research has shown that even if a doctor discloses a referral fee if you enter a trial, that actually doesn't eliminate the problem, and then sometimes it can make it worse, right? So there's ways to disclose conflicts of interest that's more that has less backlash, like unintended consequences, less unintended consequences for patients. But what I found in my research, and this is where the insinuation anxiety comes in, is that say that the doctor does recommend that you enter a clinical trial. There could be a range of reasons for you to say, no, I don't want to enter that trial. It's too risky. I'd rather stick with a drug that I've tried in the past, or I don't like those particular side effects. There could just be a range of reasons that you want to say no, which is hard enough to say no to your doctor if they're recommending something. But say that the doctor recommends that you enter the trial and then discloses the receipt of a referral fee. Now there's a very salient reason why you want to say no, right? But that insinuates that the doctor has been corrupted by that referral fee, and that is really difficult to do. And so what I've seen in my experiments is that even though trust might go down if they understand this is a conflict of interest and there's some uncertainty as to the quality of advice, at the same time, insinuation anxiety goes up, and you don't want to signal distrust. So you end up feeling more pressure to comply with disclosure than without disclosure. And that is not the intended purpose of having disclosure of conflicts of interest. So we really want to give these disclosures in advance, not directly from the advisor, hopefully from somebody else, not the advisor themselves, and give patients a choice of what advisor they want to go to. Maybe if somebody discloses the absence of any conflicts of interest, then trust justifiably increases. And if we have a choice to seek independent advisors, that's the ideal situation.
Yeah. Well, again, super timely as we approach the 2025 dietary guidelines determination for what in America in the United States we have the dietary, every 5 years the dietary guidelines for Americans are published, and it was just revealed that 9 of 20 panel members for this current iteration, next year's iteration of the dietary guidelines, have conflicts of interest with the food industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and as could be expected, the scientific report that serves as the foundation for what ultimately will be the dietary guidelines for Americans, the latest version of it, is rife with shoddy science, and it's really screwed up. And those disclosures are not made. They're not made in advance. The public is completely in the dark about it. What do we do about this?
I don't know. It's a problem when the people who are writing the guidelines have conflicts of interest. And I've actually done some research looking at sort of committee composition and conflicts of interest and how it makes a difference, because guidelines for not just dietitians and guidelines for that, but like whether you should certain classes of drugs like statins or radiation, x-rays, any of those guidelines, they're built out of people, right? And when the composition of the people on the committee changes, the guidelines change. So you get different guidelines in different countries. You know, the UK is different to the US, is different to Canada. And even within the US, depending on, you know, which body is putting forward the guideline, it also differs. And so it's really worrying, because that's the one thing that you hope you can trust, right? I'm following the guidelines, but whose guidelines and how conflicted are those guidelines? You know, so it's a pity that we're in that situation, and whether there is better guidance as to how to compose those committees to make them more independent. You know, keep the expertise, keep the specialist input, but make them independent.
So would you say getting the conflicts of interest out?
As much as possible.
Yeah,
as much as possible. If we can eliminate conflicts of interest or mitigate them, I think there's so much. I mean, I've done so much work on disclosure of conflicts of interest and transparency. And I do think it's important. Like, if your advisor has a conflict of interest, you know, there's a right that you should know about it. But just highlighting the fact that there's a conflict of interest, all it does is reveal there's a conflict of interest, but it hasn't actually managed it in any way. It's still there. And just hoping that, oh, I'm still going to give my honest opinion, I'm still going to do this. We don't know, right? Because we are unintentionally biased at times, and it doesn't mitigate that. So it's a really difficult one. And rather than trying to sort of maintain these conflicts of interest and give advice and get around it with a second opinion or with disclosure, what if we just try to eliminate the conflict of interest in the first place? That's going to have the biggest effect size in terms of improving the quality of advice.
Of course. So you're saying disclosure is the fact that disclosure might plant a seed of skepticism. It's not sufficient?
It's not sufficient. And in fact, if you are what we call cognitively loaded, which is just overwhelmed, especially like if you're a sick patient or something, if you're overwhelmed or you just have so much information coming at you, I've found that disclosure can actually not just plant the seed of skepticism, it can actually increase trust at times. And so that's really worrying, that especially if people don't have the time to deliberate and think, what does this disclosure actually mean? And people start associating those disclosures with expertise, right? Sometimes, you know, if people are, for example, there was a time when physicians would have lots of relationships with industry and disclose them as almost a badge of expertise, right? I'm a consultant for so many different, you know, for Pfizer, for another pharmaceutical company or a medical device manufacturer, because I'm an expert. And people sometimes take those disclosures as a sign of expertise, when it should really be planting a seed of, oh, there could be some uncertainty here as to the quality of advice I'm receiving.
That's so interesting. Well, yeah, it's very interesting because it builds trust. It should build trust, though, because it's better to disclose your conflicts of interest
there is
than
that
to
aspect.
hide them.
Yeah, but I looked into whether mandatory or voluntary disclosure makes a difference, and it doesn't really. So it's not so much rewarding people for their honesty. It's more that if we're not deliberating on it, if we process the disclosures what we call peripherally or automatically, then sometimes we can see it as a sign of expertise. And I call that disclosures expertise cue. So.
Super interesting. Wow. Yeah, I mean, this has come up a lot over the past month, I would say, with the transition team of the new administration in the United States. You know, a lot of, I would say, the conflicts of interest in our regulatory agencies has come into the spotlight, come under fire. And I've certainly, you know, gone on major national television to report on it, essentially. But that, you know, for example, the FDA, half of its budget comes from what are called user fees from the pharmaceutical industry. A little bit, you know, there's a smaller proportion that comes from the food industry, but most of it comes from the drug industry. And so 50% almost of the FDA's budget comes from the industry that it's supposed to be regulating and overseeing, right? And then you find out additionally that a lot of the high-level officers at the Food and Drug Administration will one day ultimately as history has shown, take jobs within the pharmaceutical industry. There's like this revolving door aspect of things. Yeah. It's really screwed up.
It's really difficult because if somebody is paying your salary, that becomes really difficult, right? It's a huge conflict of interest. And then you have the revolving door, and it's so intertwined that sort of disentangling all those relationships and conflicts of interest becomes really difficult to sort out, right? When I started looking into sort of the relationships between industry and doctors and drug manufacturers, and it just becomes like, how did we get into such a mess, right? Because it's just so difficult to disentangle. So healthy amount of skepticism there is good. Finding doctors that can disclose the absence of conflicts of interest is also wonderful. Yeah.
So look for experts who have no conflicts of interest to declare.
Yeah, if you can find them.
If you can find them. Well, you're a physician. I mean, with the current insurance model and whatever, I feel like it's I mean, there's value in supplementary income, right? Like, I mean, it's become harder than ever to monetize a practice, particularly if you're within a hospital setting.
Well, one of the key differences, I think.
Also, doctors come out of school like heavily in debt.
That's right? And like, if we're talking about sort of the pros and cons of having your pre-med before you do medical school, by that time you've racked up like a huge amount of debt. I got my medical education for free in the UK at that time, right? Education was free for everyone. There's a small cost now, but not as much as in the US. But when we look at the for-profit medical industry here and the healthcare industry, we're not just talking about relationships with industry. We're also talking about sort of paying physicians for every test or procedure that's done results in a conflict of interest if it's the same physician that's recommending that test or procedure. Right? So that is something that can lead to over-diagnosis, over-treatment. And, people talk about illnesses getting missed with the National Health Service. So it's not that any one healthcare system is the best, but in the US, if you do have a for-profit system, that should be on your mind, right? Is this test absolutely necessary? Is this surgery absolutely necessary? What are the risks? What are the benefits? And what are the alternatives? And this is where I talk about in my book as well, sort of informed consent, right? I take it from medicine, which is really important, and you can apply it to other decisions in your life. But the elements that I needed, there's 5 key elements. So the first one is capacity. So the mental capacity to make the decision. You're not under the influence of any drugs or alcohol or like any illness that affects your mental capacity. So that's number 1. Number 2 is knowledge, right? Do you have all the information to make this decision? And then 3 is understanding, right? Do you understand that knowledge, the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives? Do you understand all those things? Number 4 is the freedom to say no, because if you don't have the freedom to say no, you really can't consent, right? You're simply complying, you're going along with it, but you're not consenting. It's not true consent. And then the 5th element, if you can say yes to all those things, I have the capacity, the knowledge, the understanding, I can say I have the freedom to say no, only then can you authorize informed consent if you want to go along with it, or if you don't, your informed refusal. And so having those things in place before you make a decision is really essential. Otherwise, you just end up complying.
Yeah. How can listeners and viewers comfortably and assertively say no in high-pressure environments?
So in high-pressure environments, we can't just wish ourselves, if we have not practiced defiance before, to suddenly become defiant, right? We need to think about it beforehand. And having said all the things that I have today, and with the knowledge, the capacity, knowledge, understanding, and the freedom to say no, as a physician, one of the things I found astounding was when I moved to the US and I was recommended a CT scan to investigate whether I had a pulmonary embolism. And a pulmonary embolism is a blood clot in the lungs. I worked in respiratory medicine in the UK, and I know that that type of blood clot in the lungs, it brings a specific type of pain. We call it pleuritic chest pain. And it's a very sharp type of pain. It catches your breath as you breathe in and breathe out. That wasn't the pain I was having at all. So I knew the test was completely unnecessary. I knew a CT scan gives you on average about 70 times more radiation than an X-ray. Why take the risk of having that, if it's unnecessary? So I should have said no. I had all the knowledge, the understanding, I had everything, but I couldn't say no, right? And that's because it wasn't even that much of a high pressure situation. When you think about all the other situations that are high pressure, it was safe and effective for me. And that's because I hadn't practiced saying no. And often we are in situations where we've complied in the past, and that can help us think about why couldn't I say no in that situation? What was it? What were the factors that kept me compliant? Right? Just because the doctor said so, I went with it. And I'm, privileged in that aspect that I did have all the elements for true informed consent or refusal in that particular instant. But I was so used to being compliant and sort of putting 100% trust in the doctor that I was just like, okay. And that allowed me to think the next time this happens, this is what I'm going to do. It allowed me to think about my aspirational self. I wasn't as surprised, because surprise really disables defiance, whereas anticipating really helps it. So you're anticipating it, you're visualizing it, you're practicing it, then your neural pathways change. And the next time that happens and you're in that moment, which to some people is high pressure, then you can say no. And you don't even have to say no in a very loud or aggressive way. You can say it, you can just start with saying, I'm not comfortable with that. Because these 5 stages of defiance that I've uncovered. So the first one is tension, that signal to your body that this might need some resistance, this might need defying. Don't ignore it, articulate it, acknowledge it to yourself, and then vocalize it to someone else. And that can be just as simple as saying, I'm not comfortable with this, or asking for clarification. So as soon as you ask for clarification, it raises the volume on the situation, right? So people then start thinking about it a little bit more. Also, saying out loud to someone else you're not comfortable with it is actually really critical, because then you can't go back and rationalize to yourself, oh, you were fine with it anyway, and come up with a million reasons why it was okay, because you've actually said this out loud. And the research shows if you get to that stage 3, you're more likely to get to the final act of defiance, because what comes after that is just a threat of non-compliance. Like, I don't think I can go along with this. So once you get to that point, then the last step is the final act of defiance. And practicing those things and being aware of that is actually the key to becoming a more defiant person, because, as I said, it's a practice, not a personality. And there's this wonderful quote that's often attributed to Bruce Lee, but it was actually a Greek poet that said, under duress, so these high pressure moments, under duress, we don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. So you have to train for defiance, you have to make it a practice, and you have to become more comfortable with just saying those words out loud and getting your brain used to hearing them, and your ears used to hearing them, and your mouth used to saying them, right? So.
I love it. It reminds me of a funny anecdote to share that might be useful, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But when I was in high school, there was a kid in my high school. His name was Davin, actually. I think that was his name. And he was like he had a really strong personality. He was super charismatic, way more charismatic than I was. And he had a ton of friends. And I remember like asking him or maybe I was like overhearing memory is like somewhat faltering, but I just remember specifically either I asked him to do something, or somebody that I was like in a friend circle and somebody had asked him to do something, and he said no. And the person asked, why not? And he said, I don't want to. And that has stuck with me for the entirety of my life. And I use that because I think what people don't realize is that I don't want to, that's a reason.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't have to justify,
explain
it anymore if there's something that you're being asked to do that you don't want to do.
Yeah.
And so like when people ask me to do something now that I don't feel comfortable doing, if I'm, if it's whether it's outside of my comfort zone, or I just don't feel like it's an appropriate thing to do, or I'd just rather not do it for whatever reason, I just say, I don't want to.
Yeah. So, and it's really great that you observed that, right? That you saw that, because that made a difference to you. And I often think that defiance doesn't just change you, right? Because if you're able to defy, there are a lot of benefits, right? You can live a life more aligned with your values. It's a more joyful, honest life, right? But it also changes the people that observe it, because it had an effect on you and it stayed with you. And whenever I've seen someone do something defiant, I'm like, that's really interesting, you know. So it's not just your own experience, it's observing other people too. That really has this ripple effect. And if you think about it, all our everyday acts of consent and defiance and compliance, that creates the society we live in. So it's really important, you know, because it affects our lives, our workplaces, our communities. And that's why I'm really passionate about defiance.
Yeah, I love it. How can this help us in interpersonal relationships?
So in interpersonal relationships, I think,
like romantic relationships.
Oh, in romantic, like if you're, so everybody has values, right? And I very much talk about values-based defiance. And this means like, so identifying who you are and what's important to you. So say, for example, when I have my executive students really think about their values and write them down, like at first it might be, grown, right? I have to think about my values and what they are. But we don't often make our values very explicit. And it's really helpful because clarifying your values, it's been shown that you're more likely to act in alignment with them. So if you clarify them, then that's fantastic. And clarifying and writing them down has also been shown to sort of decrease your stress responses, your cortisol levels. So being really clear that, you know, integrity is really important to me, or, you know, compassion is really important. Like knowing what your values are and like how you want to live every day in alignment with them is really helpful. And then with defiance, you want to ask, is this safe? Is this effective? In a romantic relationship, you would hope the answer to both of those is always yes, right? That your partner it is safe to say what you want, and it should be effective that your partner is listening to you. If it's not, then you might want to rethink that romantic relationship. And then the next aspect, which is, so I talk about this defiance compass, is to ask, who am I? Which is your values. What type of situation is this? Is it safe and effective? And then what does a person like me do in a situation like this? What does a person like me with these values of integrity and fairness, how do I want to act, right? What is it that I do? What's my responsibility? And then do I have the ability to actually defy? And that's what we want to really think about when we think about values-based defiance, right? Does this align? This is not just about saying no because, you know, we don't want to go to that particular restaurant, right? Which is important also because you don't want to be always acquiescence to your sort of partner's needs, because you also have a need to be heard and listened to and have your preferences taken into consideration. So maybe equality is one of your values, and that's important for you to sort of speak up about, right? So the way that you communicate, of course, is really important. But saying these are my values, putting them forwards, especially if it's causing harm to someone else or to yourself, it's very important to be able to vocalize that and speak up when it matters most.
So it's okay to have disagreement.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, if you see defiance as just having disagreements rather than living your life in alignment. And I should say, this is one of the things that I think has substantially changed how I think, is that we've misunderstood what it means to defy. Right? So the Oxford English Dictionary talks about defiance as challenging the power of another person, like either boldly and openly. And I shouldn't really disagree with the Oxford English Dictionary because I was brought up in England after all. But I actually think that's too narrow a focus for defiance. And my definition is that to defy means to act in accordance with your values when there is pressure to do otherwise. And so if we reframe defiance from that negative connotation to this values-based defiance, it becomes a proactive social force in society, a pro-social force. And so defiance can be reframed as something that's going to help another person, or it's going to help you live with your values.
I love what you said about stepping outside of yourself and like asking what a person of my constitution might do in this situation. Like it's like a very meta view.
Yes. Yeah, because one of the biggest things is that what I've seen time and time again, what people believe who they are and how they act, there's a huge gap between them. And you want to decrease that gap and just asking yourself that question: what does a person like me with these values do in this situation? You know, it's just really powerful.
Are there any instances where defiance is unhelpful?
Well, it depends what you mean by unhelpful, because they can be costs of defiance, right? So it can have consequences. And so if that's unhelpful to you, you need to take the consequences into consideration. And you might want to think about that under that, what type of situation is that? Is it safe? If it's not physically safe to defy, then you want to not just have like the default compliance that I spoke about that we're wired to, but what I call conscious compliance, which is we have all the elements for we consent, they are there, but it's too costly, or not, the benefits are going to be too meager. And in those situations, we might want to consciously comply for the time being until we're in a safer situation or more effective situation that we can defy.
That makes sense. What's the relationship between compliance and groupthink? Because compliance to me evokes like changing your behavior or doing something, undertaking like some action to appease a group. But groupthink is like even more insidious to me. It's like it evokes like brainwashing and stuff like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of terms here. So compliance is to go along with something, and it's usually imposed by some external thing that you're going along without really thinking about the elements of consent. It's not consent, it's compliance, right? So I distinguish between compliance and consent. Now, going along with the group can also be called conformity, right? So if you think about, I don't know if you've heard of Ash's line experiments, where there was an experiment done many, many years ago where people would look at 3 lines and then they would have one other line and they had to match it. And the answer was pretty obvious, but if you put in a group where everybody is saying the wrong answer, you then want to conform to the rest of the group, right? And people might call that social pressure. It's like, oh, if everybody else is saying that, surely I'm wrong, But so going along with, say, everybody in your work group wants to go to restaurant A and you want to go to restaurant B, and then you just say, okay, fine. You're kind of conforming to the group by doing what they want, like putting up the black square. You're conforming, right, with what everybody else wants you to do. And then the group think is that everybody's thinking the same thing, right? Because when you're discussing something in a group, you might end up discussing only the same points and not challenging sort of counterpoints. So there are differences between them, but compliance doesn't mean that it's always part of a group. There could just be one other person, or it could just be an expectation. And what I found in some of my experiments is that people will comply even with a stranger, right? If a stranger gives them really bad advice and they know that it's bad advice, they comply a lot of the time. So they're related in some ways, but also distinct. They have distinct terms in psychology.
What are some like really insidious social pressures, like the pressure to drink alcohol? That's a big one.
Yeah. So again, there's peer pressures to do lots of different things, and in those situations, I talk about I talk about false defiance again, which is a little bit easier. That if you think you're being defiant by, for example, putting up a black square or going on a particular march, is it that you're really doing it because that's what you believe in, or because everybody else is doing it?
Yeah.
And, the ability to sort of defy those aspects is really to ask yourself, those questions, which can become really hard, because sometimes then that kind of false defiance, all it looks like is compliance with the rest of the group. And it becomes really difficult to know, what is the reason I'm going on this march? Is it because I really align with these values? Has it come from within me, or is it because everybody else wants me to?
Yeah, it can be hard sometimes to say, I guess that's the whole topic of your book, like saying no when there's immense social pressure to comply, and I think like every younger person has had that experience of like going to the bar with their friends. Yes. And everybody's drinking, and you don't really want to have a drink, but because everybody is drinking, then it's like, well, why not?
Yeah.
And then you end up regretting it.
And so having those strategies in mind and practicing, what are you going to say? Like, oh, not tonight. I'm going to stick with this for the time being. Oh, maybe the next one, but not. And then that happens. You say that all throughout the night. There's numerous ways that are going to be unique to each person as to how they address that. But you need to become comfortable with your form of defiance that you're able to do with the least angst, that doesn't have you complying with something that you don't want to do.
Yeah. Again, just use, I don't want to. Like that to me that's enough. Mm-hmm. Also, unhealthy eating. We're in the midst of the holiday season right now. A lot of people are spending time with their families, which is an amazing, wonderful thing. But also, not everybody within the family unit shares the same values with regards to eating healthily. And, there is the phenomena of holiday weight gain. I don't think that's surprising to anybody, because you're in a novel environment. You're eating a lot of confectionery foods around people that you love all the time. Sometimes there's pressure to eat in a way that maybe you were brought up that doesn't necessarily align with your present values around food. So this is all, super useful advice. Yeah,
absolutely. Like what are what's really helpful, I think, is to script beforehand, just really simple scripts of, I would prefer not to, just a simple no thank you, right? As you said, I'd rather not,
I like that. So cool. What an important topic, especially today. We also just got out of, the election cycle. In your research, have you uncovered any of the tactics that, media has used to get people to comply or adopt certain values or beliefs around, different things? The media, in many ways, I think this is the legacy media, for a long time has sort of dominated the conversation about many different topics, and has adopted certain tactics to steer the conversation. Again, about myriad topics. But I think it's important to like see behind to go behind the curtain and to understand like how the media tends to do that, like some of the tactics that they may use. Does that come up in your research at all?
No, it's an aspect of the information that we receive. So if we're going back to sort of the elements of consent and if we're trying to make a decision based on the information that we've received, and a lot of the information comes from the media, right? That's what we're fed in terms of news. And do we have full information, and do we understand it completely, are the two questions. And depending on what newsfeed comes your way, the information we get might be distorted or incomplete. And so we need to ask ourselves, are we getting the full information here? And always be thinking about returning to the beginning of our conversation, what is the agenda here right now? So with the media, is it sensationalized so people will watch more or watch for longer? Or what is the truth behind it? So thinking about what are people's agenda, what's their filter, and trying to understand that is really key to sort of healthy critical thinking.
Yeah, the media has conflicts the media is rife, particularly the legacy media, but all media essentially. We have sponsors of this podcast. All media has, just in some capacity, conflicts of interest. And there's something that I learned from my friend Callie Means, who's been sort of on the campaign trail talking about this quite a bit, the fact that, pharmaceutical, which I think is fascinating, and I hadn't heard it put this way before, and it really stuck with me, and it seems obviously true, that these pharmaceutical companies, they buy up airwaves, and they have their ads for their myriad drugs on the nightly, during prime time. You would expect that those ads are there to influence the consumers, which they may be to some, in some part, but that they're there primarily to influence the airwaves, because, like these news programs, like the salaries of the people who work at these companies are being paid by essentially the pharmaceutical companies that are buying up their airwaves.
Yes. But would they make the same decision if it didn't have an impact on the bottom line? Right.
Would they be more objective about certain pharmaceuticals and things like that? That's the question. Super important. So what's next for you in your research? I mean, I know you've got this book on the horizon. Where do you think you'll be taking your research in the next, short term, long term?
Yeah, so I'm delving more into these issues, right? There's so many unanswered questions still in terms of like why people comply and why we how can we defy more easily. So I'm looking at things like, stress in the workplace, especially, again, sort of the pandemic brought around a huge amount of stress, especially for healthcare workers too. And how can we decrease burnout and increase well-being in clinicians is one area of research that I'm looking at, currently collecting data on sort of interventions to reduce burnout and increase well-being and increase sort of speaking up at work, which also has an impact on those things. I'm looking at sort of what I call the voice empathy gap, as in some of the research I've done looking at nurses and nurse managers. They come up with completely different reasons for why they believe nurses don't speak up if they see an error in the workplace. So the nurses mention things like sort of safety and whether it's going to be effective or not, right? They mention those two factors, like either, I didn't feel safe, I was worried about my job, I thought there'd be repercussions if I spoke up, or that, it's not that I don't feel safe, but I've spoken up several times and nothing gets done. Like, this is how effective it's going to be. In research terms, we call it instrumentality. If nothing's going to change, then why would you speak up? But regardless of the nurses sort of saying these are the reasons for not speaking up, the nurse managers were coming up with very different reasons for why the nurses didn't speak up. And that's because they didn't think the nurses were taking enough responsibility. They were sort of saying it's not my job to do it, or that they didn't have the skill set or ability to do it. And that sort of gap between like what the nurse managers think and the nurses think is a real problem, because then nothing is going to change, right? So the environment is not going to change to be more safe and effective if the nurse managers think it's the nurses' faults and the nurses think it's the environment. So sort of decreasing that empathy gap and looking at interventions for that, and what really sort of creates this huge gap between sort of people's viewpoints as well, how easy it is to speak up and defy. So that's keeping me busy too. Many other aspects on insinuation anxiety, whether it's more likely in certain people than others to experience, and what are some of the sort of boundary effects of that too. So yeah, so delving in much more into this research.
Well, how can organizations foster a more comfortable, an environment where it is more comfortable to speak up, but not just like organizations like companies, but also like within families? Yeah,
so having what we call a psychologically safe environment where people are not penalized for speaking up, right? It's safe for them to do so and effective. So if the group in itself feels that, and that means every member of the group thinks this is a group where it's safe to speak up and you're not going to get attacked for speaking up. So how do you create those types of groups, right? Is something that sort of business consultants have been trying to do for a very long time, is so it starts from the top down, like having leaders model that, making it safe for people to speak up, encouraging dissent, sort of modeling dissent as well when it's needed, and showing that there's no consequences of doing that it is going to be effective. They are going to listen and do something about it, that there's going to be some what we call procedural justice, right? So some explanation as to why these things are happening and what's going to be implemented to make a change. But having that sort of open door policy that's actually real, that you can speak up and you're not going to be punished for it, and we are going to do something about it.
And does that also apply to parents? Creating an environment where their children feel comfortable in speaking up about
absolutely
things?
Absolutely. So sort of raising children not just to do as you're told, right? So be compliant. You want to encourage your children to speak up when they notice something, or if they think something's unfair. You want to have that conversation with them and encourage them to do so, not just reward them for compliance. So making an environment that's safe for them to do so is also important. And in fact, sort of seeing your parents defy in a situation that calls for values-based defiance is really powerful. And so many people I've interviewed, when we think about defiance and the effect it has on you, if they've seen their parent defy, it usually stays with them for a long time.
Yeah. My mom would always speak up when she saw something that she felt she needed to speak up about. I mean, that it, a lot of the times for her, when she was a big animal rights activist, she was very vocal about the mistreatment of animals. And I grew up around that. But then also, like, for example, like if we were in a restaurant and she wasn't happy with the appetizer, or if it came out cold or whatever, my mom, like, I've encountered some people who will just like grin and bear it.
Yeah.
Never my mom. She would always speak up and either, have the dish taken back, get a new one, or get it taken off the bill. And that just permeated, like, just seeing how she moved about the world, being unafraid to defy. That's, I think, deeply embedded in me, and is, looking back at my body of work and everything, throughout like my career choice, my educational choices socially, like it's definitely something that like I value.
Yeah. So I think it's hugely important for parents to role model sort of that defiance to their children and make it safer for them, safe environments, because if children can't practice being defiant at home, they have to learn right later on in life. So.
100%. Amazing. Well, so who do you write Defy for? I mean, who is like the person who stands to gain the most from picking up this book?
Well, first of all, this is the type of book I wish I had growing up, before my careers in academia, in medicine, just sort of day-to-day life. I would have found this work really helpful to me. And if you have ever sort of been the type of person that's just wanted to opt out of something or disagree, and then you've just shaken your head or sighed and gone along with it, this book is for you. If you've ever felt like you have found something unjust and you couldn't speak up, and you wondered why you just stood by and did nothing, it's for you as well. It's for managers that want to create a more psychologically safe environment. I mean, the people in the book are of all different types and ages, so men and women, police officers, gymnasts, students, managers, police officers. It's a whole array of people, and that's because everybody really needs defiance in their lives. And so, this book is really for everyone.
For everybody.
And I mean, it changed my life doing the research in this book, and I hope it changes the people that read it too.
Have you found yourself, have you become more defiant of a person?
Yeah, because it's a work in progress, and every time I read my own words, I find it extremely helpful. So yes, it does remind me, because it comes back to what does a person like me do in a situation like that. So I can tap into my aspirational self more and think, well, yes, I need to role model defiance. So this is what a person like me does in a situation like this.
It's so cool. Well, this was so fun. Thanks for coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoyed it very much.
Where can listeners pick up your book? Where can they connect with you? Are you on social media?
I am. So you can go to my website, which is sunitasah.com. You'll find everything on there, like my LinkedIn and Instagram. You can connect with me on there. I also have a newsletter on Substack called Defiant by Design. So you can subscribe to that for free. And I would love to connect in any of those two ways.
I love it. The book's available everywhere, I would assume.
Yes.
All the major bookstores.
You can pre-order now. Yeah.
Pre-order now, yeah.
So,
all the things. Defy, the power of no in a world that demands yes. Well, Dr. Sunita Sah, one last question for you. What does it mean to you to live a genius life? What does living a genius life mean to you?
Yeah, I love that question. And so there is a quote that Viktor Frankl, who's the Austrian psychiatrist, said, and I'm going to paraphrase, that between stimulus and response, there is space. And in that space is our response. And within our response, there is growth and freedom. And that space, so between stimulus and response, is where we can take a pause, right? I call it the power of the pause. So I've spoken about sort of the default compliance, or what you can even call like knee-jerk compliance, like we fall into it. I also don't want us to have knee-jerk defiance. It's like values-driven defiance. So you take that pause and really think and ask yourself, who am I? What type of situation is this? And what does a person like me do in a situation like that? And if you can do that, I think learning how to defy in that way leads to a more genius life. It's a more honest, joyful life if you can live authentically in that way.
Beautifully put. Very thoughtful. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.